Hello, this webinar deals with the Pilgrims Story, where their ideas came from, and it takes a look at a 100-year period of time up to the Pilgrims' departure and shows the genesis of their ideas and how they lived them out and eventually how those ideas still influence our country today. A look at 3 Christian leaders as well as 2 queens and a king of England as these ideas are developed over a 100-year period of time. So let's get started. Where did it all come from? Well, Martin Luther, a well-known name, was a monk in Germany. He was a part of a key movement called the Reformation, which was a movement of individual Christian leaders saying that the people needed to have a readable translation of the Bible in their own hands that they could read for themselves. He was joined by others, John Calvin, who was a Frenchman that did a lot of work in Switzerland, and John Knox, who was a Reformation leader in Scotland. And all 3 of these men were leaders in their country in a movement trying to return Bible reading to the individual citizens and out of the hands of the professional clergy. This flashpoint for this movement was October 31st, 1517, known as Reformation Day, when Martin Luther nailed 95 theses, those were points of debate, on the Wittenberg door in Germany, so he would have these discussions with the church leadership of the day where their leadership departed from scriptural admonitions. So what happened from that point in time in 1517 to 1609, and where there was reforming going on but also persecution? And out of that came groups of individuals. There were the Puritans, who thought that they could work within the church to purify it. There was the Separatists that felt like they needed to leave the church because the church was just too broken. And then the Pilgrims were a subcategory of the Separatists, and they actually eventually came to the place in 1620 that they felt like they needed to go forth in order to truly apply what they were learning to their whole life and to all that they dealt with. Well, during this time, they faced persecution. Bloody Mary, a queen that has a notable drink named after her, wanted all of England to align with the Roman Catholic Church, and in 1557 over 300 men were burned at the stake for promoting the English Reformation. She was not a happy camper. This produced an exodus of over 800 English scholars to the continent of Europe. Meanwhile, the Renaissance, which was also a reformation of culture, had uncovered some additional ancient manuscripts that were excellent additional resources for Bible translation. So some of the 800 scholars began to work in Geneva. They took these ancient manuscripts and produced the Geneva Bible in 1560, and that Bible included several innovations. It was the first time that verse numbers were added to the Bible. There had been chapters before, but individual verse numbers within a chapter in order for individuals to find and memorize Scripture more effectively was an innovation. There were study notes that became extensive and maps that were all innovative for Bibles in that period of time. Once this Bible was complete, the authors dedicated it to the next queen that followed Mary, and that is Queen Elizabeth. She was more positive about the English Reformation, and so they made a dedication to her. So God used the persecution of Christians in England, drove them to Switzerland, where they made a new Bible translation that they then in turn dedicated back to a queen. Over the next 40 years, several additional editions were produced. By 1599, the most comprehensive Geneva Bible with notes was ever produced. The impact of the Geneva Bible is hard for us in our day to realize how the Bible has only been available to the common Christian in his own language for 400 years. Before the printing of Luther's German Bible in 1534 and the Geneva Bible in 1560 in English, laymen, regardless of nationality, for 1,500 years had never had a Bible of their own. That's hard to understand in this day and age, but that was true. And so individual believers or citizens have only been able to hold a translation that they could read in their hands for the last 400 years. As they began to study this Geneva Bible, their ideas began to form. They saw that God had assigned individual self-government and self-responsibility to every individual person that was following after God. They saw that God intended family to have a different jurisdiction where love, care, and provision was made for a couple and for their children, that children would be educated and that a family legacy would ensue. That the church had a role assigned by God for inspiration, encouragement, and accountability, for outreaching in the name of their faith, and in discipleship and mentoring others. And then lastly, civil government had a rather limited role. It was simply for the protection of individual citizens within that society and the provision of justice. And they began to form these ideas and want to live them out in their social and societal settings. Well, just as this was gaining steam under the understanding of Queen Elizabeth, she passed away and King James came to the throne. By 1604, King James was on the throne. He was disavowing the Catholic Church and supporting the establishment of the Church of England. He would serve as the head of the church, and he hated the Geneva Bible as it undermined the idea of the divine right of kings, that being the idea that if a king is on a throne, God must have put him there, so his way or the highway is the way that he ruled. With James in the headship, the kingship of England, it led to a renewal of persecution of English reformers. And this is what Bradford said in his books. Sometimes this is by bloody death and cruel torments. Other whiles it was by imprisonments and banishments and other hard usages, just making life hard. And having a Geneva Bible was punishable by death. So the church congregation that we would eventually become known as the Pilgrims to us found a place to meet secretly in Scrooby, England. They needed to come up with a new philosophy of church government because they were no longer under King James in the Church of England. So they established a spiritual covenant, that is a religious covenant, where they became a self-governing church according to their own ordinance of God, and they chose amongst themselves by election those leaders that were seen fit both in character and in capabilities to lead and govern in their church. Well, the persecution continued as these pilgrims and separatists were sought out. And it got to the point where in 1608 and 1609, the only recourse that this congregation felt is that they needed to get off the English Isles and go to Amsterdam, Holland, where there was religious freedom. Their first attempt was a setup by a captain who got them on board a ship and robbed them. They were cast back upon the shore. Most of their goods and valuables were lost. They were arrested, and they did not make another attempt in the short term. But a second attempt was later made, several months later, and a Dutch captain was asked to be their guide this time, and this time they came up with a strategy of loading the men on the ship first so that they could in turn help the women and children on the ship as they came out. Well, just as the women and children were about to leave the shore, the king's army came over to the shore and captured them. The Dutch captain became scared, and he sailed off, leaving the women and children behind. The men that were still behind, which were a few of them, were imprisoned and turned over to the police. And we'll catch up with the rest of their story later. But as I close, read this. The public afflictions they endured for their faith made their cause famous and led many to inquire into it, and their Christian behavior left a deep impression on the minds of many. Some few shrank from these first conflicts, and no wonder, but many more came forward with fresh courage and animated the rest. And so these spiritual people who were trying to follow after God and live out their faith were highly persecuted to the point where they needed to get off the English Isles and find religious freedom in Holland. And many people were moved by their tenacity and their courage and their bravery. And I hope it moves you as well. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.